Everyone, and welcome to the 2021 PMEA District 7 Virtual Festival. I am very happy to see all of you today. My name is Dr. Campbell, and I am the current president of District 7 and also the orchestra director at Cedar Crest High School. Our first session today is our keynote speaker, Dr. Stephen Allen, which will be followed by virtual recordings of our District 7 chorus, string orchestra, and combined upper and south bands. Dr. Allen is a professor of music at Rider University and has a PhD from Oxford University and is a world authority on the music of Benjamin Britten. In addition, Dr. Allen is an excellent performer on the euphonium and locally is the musical director of the Lancaster British Brass Band. After Dr. Allen's presentation, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. You can just unmic your microphone if you want, or you can ask a question in the chat. I will monitor the questions in the chat so that we can ask Dr. Allen directly. Welcome, Dr. Allen. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Well, you might think it's a little bit early in the morning to be dealing with Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, right? It's not exactly breakfast cereal, but it's a pleasure to be able to present something to you on this music. Benjamin Britten is an English composer, and as you can tell from my accent, I do originally come from that domain, although some people do think I'm from the Bronx. How you doing? How you doing? I've been practicing that for a long time. I hope you appreciate that. And during the 20th century, Benjamin Britten was arguably the most important English composer. And out of all of the 20th century masterpieces of music, it has been suggested that The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky and the War Requiem are two of the greatest of the masterpieces of the 20th century. And this basically resulted during the Second World War. The Nazis, the Germans, bombed Coventry, a city in England, in the Midland area. And it was a bombing that had to happen because Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, knew that the bombing was going to happen, but he couldn't prevent it, because if he prevented it, it would have signaled to the Germans that the British had cracked their codes. The British had cracked the German codes, so they're able to actually figure out what the Germans were going to do. But unfortunately, Churchill was put in the horrendous situation of having to allow the attack to happen. And it was one of the worst attacks that happened on England during the war. The town was pretty much obliterated, including the cathedral. And there was a terrible act of revenge by the British. They bombed the German town of Dresden in what was called a fire bombing at that time, pretty much devastated the city of Dresden. But after the war, in peacetime, the two cities became twins. They joined hands and they basically rebuilt their cathedrals. And in 1962, with the opening of Coventry Cathedral, Britten was commissioned to write a big piece. And he decided that he finally wanted to write the big choral piece he had been planning for many, many years, which was basically an anti-war piece, a piece that protested the nature of war, okay? Now, this is quite complicated because, of course, war happens on many levels. We have international war, like the Second World War, right? But sometimes there can be personal wars, wars between individual people, even wars within a family sometimes, which are in a sense almost the worst kind of wars. And some people say that the big wars sometimes come from the little ones. And Benjamin Britten was a very complicated man, a very complicated character. And there were a lot of issues in his life that were very, very tricky. For example, he was gay. And he was gay at a time in England when you could be arrested and actually put in prison for a long time, actually, for being homosexual. And in fact, right around the time that the War Requiem was written, there was sort of almost like a national hunt for gay people, which Britten was kind of caught up with. He was interviewed by Scotland Yard, but basically he was allowed to he was let go. I think partly because he was such an important figure in English music, very close to the royal family, and by this stage he also had a music festival in his hometown of Aldeburgh. Nonetheless, he was living with a man called Peter Pears, and it just so happens that Peter Pears was a singer, a tenor. And Britten wrote a lot of his music for his partner, and they would travel the world together, Britten playing the piano, Peter Pears singing. And it was almost this open secret that this relationship was there. And because he came from a Christian upbringing, in fact, both of them had a Christian upbringing, this also created a sort of a guilt in Britain too. And a lot of his music in this sense is about private guilt as much as it is about international guilt, if you understand what I mean. So the War Requiem, in effect, works on many different levels. It works on an international level. For example, the soprano, there are three solo singers in the piece. There's a solo soprano, the woman, who sings at the front of the cathedral with a large adult choir and an orchestra. Okay, and she was Russian she was meant to be Russian in the world premiere, but for all kinds of political reasons, the Russian singer wasn't allowed over. So it's actually sung by an English woman on the day, but it was meant to be a Russian. And the recording when it was made with the Russian singer. Then Benjamin Britten's partner, Peter Pears, was the tenor, an Englishman. And the German, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, was German. So in effect, you had Russian, English, and German soloists that represented this kind of international, very much bound up with the countries that were involved in the war. What's interesting is that the two male soloists, and that's important, right, given what we now know about Britain, it was Peter Pears and Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. Benjamin being a tenor, Fischer-Dieskau being a baritone, a bass baritone. They were actually separated from the stage with their own chamber orchestra. Okay, so you have the soprano and the choir and the orchestra, then you have the two men in the chamber choir, a chamber orchestra, and then at the back of the cathedral was an organ with boys' choir. Now this bit is even more tricky and it's very delicate because Britten also, although he had a very good upbringing himself, he came from sort of a middle-class family, and was very close to children, he also struggled with children. He never acted on it, which is a wonderful thing. There are a number of people that really investigated this, actually. There's even a television program that came out on it. And although he was very close to children, especially boys, and he wrote a lot of music for them, he never acted on his impulse. And to some extent, part of this is to do with complicated problems with the idea of innocence. What does it mean to be an innocent child? And as we know, there are some children that aren't innocent, right? Because experience comes to people at different stages in life. But Benjamin Britten basically said, I stopped growing at the age of 13, and I basically remained a boy for the rest of my life. He had a very, very big problem with being an adult, even though actually he was a very efficient adult. He was very supremely professional in every area of his adult life, but he didn't enjoy adults much. He didn't enjoy adult company as much as he enjoyed being around children. And being around children enabled him to sort of reimagine his own childhood when he was innocent. Okay, so again, this touches on the idea of sin. When does a child become accountable for sin? When does a child know it's sinning? And in a sense, when does a child fall from its innocent state into a state of experience? And to some extent, Britten wanted to go back to childhood simply because it would free him from guilt. All right, children often do naughty things and don't know that they're being naughty. And in that sense, they're innocent. And this is why Britten had this complicated, if you like, a double problem or a double challenge in his life at that time, especially, as I said, in that period of history in 1962. So with the boys' choir at the back of the church, if you can follow the logic here, with the two men and the chamber orchestra at the front of the church, and with, if you will, society, okay, the society in which they're living, which is the choir and the big orchestra at the front, you've got these three different performing forces, okay? Of course, so the Requiem Mass itself had a great tradition going back to Mozart and Verdi, who were both atheists. This is interesting. They wrote famous pieces of religious music, but both composers themselves were atheists. And Britten was a huge fan of Mozart in particular. Was, I think, in many ways, very close to Mozart in spirit. And he also, of course, appreciated the Verdi, which is a huge, really, really powerful piece of music. Another composer called Hector Berlioz, a French composer, had also written a Requiem. And of course, Britten knew all of these. And to some extent, they come out in this work in different kinds of ways. But what was new and what was different is that Britten, in his War Requiem, decided not only to have the Catholic Mass, which was the regular, traditionally understood pieces of music that were often sung at a Requiem Mass in the Catholic Church, but he decided to insert poems by a First World War poet called Wilfred Owen. And Owen was a similarly conflicted kind of person. He had similar kinds of personal struggles that Britten did. This is why part of the reason why I think Britten engaged with him. And of course, Wilfred Owen did fight during the First World War and very sadly was killed at the end of the First World War, only days or weeks, either before or after peace had been declared. So it's a very tragic kind of death. And all school children in England were brought up as school children to learn and to revere the war poets, of whom Wilfred Owen was one of the most important, right? And of course, it's the two men and the chamber orchestra that perform the Wilfred Owen. And it's the boys and the woman, the soprano, the mother, Britten's mother, if you like, who is the soprano singer, and the choir that do the religious music. So we tend to find a spatial use of these different things. Quite complicated, isn't it? Maybe like me, you need another sip on coffee just to take all of this in. We'll listen to some music in just a moment, which will bring it home to you a little bit. In fact, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen here for a moment so that you can see what I'm looking at. And I'll talk you through, we'll actually listen to some of the music so that we can get into it a little bit. All of the Requiem masses begin with the Latin, Requiem Aeternam, Lord grant them peace, et lux perpetua, and let eternal light shine upon them, okay? So we find here, if you look at the screen, we find here, Lord grant them eternal rest, and let perpetual light or eternal light shine upon them. So this is a prayer for the dead, hoping that they'll be taken into the presence of God and that they'll be subject to light, right? They won't be in the dark, they'll be in the light, okay? And then the boys sing a Te Deicit, which translates as, thou shalt have praise in Zion, O God, and homage shall be paid to you in Jerusalem. Hear my prayer, all flesh shall come before thee, right? And the boy choir actually sing this music after the adult choir has sung the Requiem. One little detail I want to point out for you. There's a musical interval in this piece that populates the whole of the War Requiem, and it's technically called, if you've done musical theory, you might recognize it, it's technically called a tritone, which are basically three whole tones stacked up on top of each other, two minor thirds, okay? Let me see if I can sing it for you. It goes, la, da, 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 da. And in Latin, that interval was called the Diabolos in Musica in Latin, which means the devil in music. It was an illegal interval. You were not allowed to use it in Catholic music, in Catholic masses. If you did use it, it meant the devil was in the music, and the devil had to be corrected either by being raised half a step to a perfect fifth, isn't that interesting, or lowered half a step into a perfect fourth, a sharp or a flat. And because sharps and flats weren't meant to exist, they were called fictional music, musica ficta, music that doesn't exist really, but it just exists to control the devil. Isn't that interesting? But in the War Requiem, Benjamin Britten doesn't correct the devil. In fact, the devil's interval sounds throughout the whole piece. And at the beginning, we're going to hear the devil's interval in the sound of the bells, which sound like church bells, okay? And we're also going to hear it when the boy choir come in. We're going to hear it in the violins, in the accompaniment. It sort of swings between the phrases of the boy choir. To watch this, I'm going to play you a very famous clip from a film by a director called Derek Jarman. And it's a film that you can watch the whole thing on YouTube. It's called The War Requiem. And in this clip that you're going to see, the dead person lying on the slab is meant to be Wilfred Owen, the poet. And the nurse, who's played by the famous English actor Tilda Swinton. Some of you might recognize her when you see her if you don't recognize that name. She's very young here. This is the beginning of her movie career. She's a very famous, she's done a lot of Hollywood movies since. She plays the nurse, and we learn later on that the nurse is actually the sister of Wilfred Owen. So you're not to know that watching it here, but I'm giving you the spoiler alert here, right? Tilda Swinton is actually his sister. And there's a scene where you see her crying and screaming and covering up her eyes, which is a symbolic way of demonstrating the protest against killing in war and also death. last thing I want you to notice is that the rhythm is the rhythm of a heartbeat. Da-dum, 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 da-da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. So we have the devil's interval and we have the heartbeat. So the music is very human. Here we go. Let's have a listen to it. This is the boys. And in fact, what we see at the end there is actually the writing in Owen's own hand of the poem that is about to be sung by the tenor. So that gives you something of the flavor. It's pretty dark, isn't it? You know. And did you notice how when they sing "Et lux perpetua," "Et lux perpetua," "Et lux perpetua," "Et lux perpetua," it doesn't sound as though they're going into the light at all. It actually sounds as though, if anything, they're going down a long dark tunnel with all these echoes that are going on around there. So we're really in a piece of music that to some extent is also very emotional and very psychological at the same time. Now, just to move on, and hopefully, guys, you could all hear the tritone in there too, right? Going on a little bit now, we'll jump over into the second section of the piece, which is the Dies Irae. Now, this is the famous part in the Mass which talks about Dies Irae, Dies Illa, which is about the graves opening and the bodies rising up to God. In fact, I won't read you the Latin, I'll read you the translation. The translation goes, this day of wrath shall consume the world in ashes, as foretold by David and the Sibyl. What trembling there shall be when the judge shall come to weigh everything strictly. The trumpet, scattering its awful sound across the graves of all the lands, summon all before the throne. Dead and nature shall be stunned when mankind arises to render an account before the judge. So in this particular scene now, we have Judgment Day, and Britten begins with a series of fanfares, very brilliantly done actually, between the different members of the brass. Okay, once you've heard this music, it doesn't leave your memory very easily because it's so distinctive. And then the choir sing in these kind of jabbing, almost whispered sounds, very closely bound up with the Dies Irae in the Verdi Requiem. You don't necessarily need to know that, but there's a connection here with Verdi's Requiem in terms of the rhythm, where we get this sense of war. And you'll notice at the climax when the trumpets play ba-bam-bam, and we hear the drums. It sounds like machine gun fire and bombs going off. Very, very effective music in terms of creating this sense of not just judgment in heaven, but if you like, a kind of a war on earth, okay? Let me play you this clip, and we're going to stick for a moment with the Derek Jarman. I spent quite a lot of time trying to find the best clips I could for you of this music. And I think we're going to stick with the Derek Jarman clip for this one, simply because, again, I think his images are so good in terms of capturing the style of the music. And let me just close out here of our little, we'll lose our faces here. So this is the Dies Irae, starting with the brass. Oh, I don't know why it's doing that. Hold on just a second. It's not meant to do that. Let me just see if I can reset this. Hold on just a second, everyone. 13 minutes, 45 seconds. Let me just see if it'll start there. I have a backup plan if this doesn't work. So let's just see if it will kick in for us here. No, it won't. So let me do this. Britten Requiem, Dies Irae. And this will have to do us. Here we go. So that gives you some idea of the powerful aspect of the piece, right? It's very, very dramatic and dynamic. Of course, Britten was an opera composer, so he's very, very, at this stage in his career, he's very capable of creating these incredibly powerful images. That's why I think in that last video, it says some of these images are inappropriate, because they're very, very powerful, and sometimes they can be quite disturbing, but sometimes that's not necessarily a bad thing when you're learning. Sometimes we have to be shaken up a little bit out of our preconceived ideas of the world in order to be open to new ideas, right? So hopefully at this stage now, you've got the picture of the type of work it is in this big public sense. Now, I want to take you a little bit more now into the more personal side of things. And this is one of the settings of the Wilfred Owen. It's a terrific setting. It's like a sarcastic march, right? And it's for both the tenor and for the baritone. So if you like, it's for Benjamin Britten, the baritone, and also for Peter P as the tenor. And here are the words of the poem. It's two soldiers in the battlefield talking about their war experiences. And they say, out there, we've walked quite friendly up to death. We've sat down and eaten with him, cool and bland. Pardoned his spilling mess tins in our hands. We've sniffed the green thick odour of his breath. Our eyes wept, but our courage didn't writhe. He spat at us with bullets, and he's coughed shrapnel, shrapnel, shrapnel. We chorused when he sang aloft. We whistled while he shaved us with his scythe. Oh, death was never an enemy of ours. We laughed at him. We leagued with him. Old chum. No soldiers paid to kick against his powers. We laughed, knowing that better men would come and greater wars. When each proud fighter brags, he wars on death for life, not men for flags. So this is the soldier now realizing that once you're in the battle, once you're actually in the hole, being bombed and shot at, you're no longer really fighting a war for a country or for a flag. You're actually fighting the war just to survive and also to help your fellow soldiers to survive. It's a comradeship between soldiers is kind of the idea here. And I have a wonderful performance of this piece to show you from a couple of very great Benjamin Britten performers singing this particular song. So again, let us lose our faces from the side here, and I'll play you Out There.
In our hands, the green thick corner of his breath. Oh, but not panic, didn't rise, not panic, didn't rise. He spat at us with bullets and his paws. We chorus when he sang along. We whistle while he shaved us with his scythe. Oh, that was never enemy of ours. We laughed at him, we leagued with him, oh chum. No soldiers paid to kick against his stars. We laughed, knowing that better men would come and make a war. When each proud fighter brags he was on death, not so
So as you can tell, the style of that music is very, very different from the style of the religious music that we've just been hearing elsewhere, right? It's chirpy, it's clipped, it's sarcastic, it's mocking even, right? It's sort of mocking the idea of death, and it's valuing the idea of being alive and understanding and appreciating what life is. The other thing I want to tell you is this, and this is kind of interesting, right? A lot of these people, not these people in these videos, but a lot of the people that perform this work were personal friends of Britten's. So, for example, you saw the camera there pointing at different instruments, the drummer, the horn player, the flute player, the clarinet player, all had little solos, right? All of those people were personal friends of Benjamin Britten's, and he knew exactly how to write for them, not just their instruments, but how to actually write for them as players, which gives his music, again, this very special quality of friendship and comradeship, which is very, very, very interesting. Let me play you now a little of the Sopranos music, and this is an interesting one here because the soprano singer, it's been speculated, represents Benjamin Britten's mother. So that in a sense, if you will, see if you can follow this along with this. If Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears, who are the tenor and the baritone over here, are in this relationship, which Britten feels guilty about because he's very close to his mother was very religious, and she brought him up to be a good little boy, a good little English public school boy, right? And it actually wasn't until she died that he began the relationship with Peter Pears. So if you imagine now that Benjamin Britten is looking at his mother is singing with society, right? The choir represents the whole of society who condemn the kind of relationship that they have. And Britten is in effect wanting his mother not to condemn him, but to bless him from beyond the grave. He's hoping that his mother in his wildest dreams will somehow forgive his sins, if you want to see it in that kind of way. So the way the soprano is written for in this sense is quite interesting. You'll notice that the soprano is quite stern sounding, a little bit like a school matron. And what makes this particular setting of the Sanctus interesting is Benjamin Britten had done a world tour in the middle of the 1950s. He'd gone out with Peter Pears on a 6-month tour of Asian countries, and he ended up in Bali, the country of Bali, where they have gamelan orchestras, and these are percussion orchestras that have lots of jangly, like xylophones and vibraphones and gongs. They're very jangly. And what Benjamin Britten does is he uses those jangly bells, the Balinese, Asian sort of bells, at this point in the Sanctus. Now, of course, in the Catholic Mass at this point, Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus means holy, holy, holy. And it's the moment where the bread and the wine are turned into, according to Catholic tradition, are turned into the body and the blood of Jesus. So Britten is using this Asian percussion orchestra, if you like, to sound a little bit like the Catholic bells, but not Catholic. It's now Asian, not Catholic, but actually another religion or no religion, a mystery religion, if you like, from the Far East. And isn't it interesting that they're playing the tritone? They're playing the devil's interval when you hear them play in the different ways. So let me play you a little bit of this Sanctus. The soprano is singing the words in Latin. I'll give you the translation. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. Heaven and earth are full of your glory. Hosanna in the highest. Holy. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. Holy, holy, holy. And here we have one of the most wonderful of modern singers, Anna Netrebko, a Russian. So this is good, right? Because we actually have a Russian soprano, which is what Benjamin Britten originally wanted. He actually wanted a Russian soprano to sing this part. And this is a singer who is still very much active in the recording world. And here she is. Let me just, again, take our faces off the picture here. Here is the Sanctus. With German subtitles. Now, what we're going to hear now is the choir are going to be saying Pleni Sunt Caeli, peace on earth and goodwill to all men, but they're going to be speaking it very, very quickly. Have a listen. And then we hear the Hosanna as Christ enters Jerusalem. So there we heard a little bit of the Hosanna as well. So once again, we're getting this incredible range of different types of musical expression that Britten is using. He's using the soprano, he's using everybody muttering, you know, peace on earth, heaven and earth are full of your glory. And then this big Hosanna as Christ enters Jerusalem, the famous passage in the Bible where Christ enters Jerusalem on the donkey. The very last piece of music I want to play you today, to close out our musical thing here, is the Agnus Dei. And in the Agnus Dei, we get probably the most intimate moment in the war Requiem. This is the part in the Mass where the parishioners go to the front and they actually receive the body and blood of Jesus in the Catholic tradition. Okay, it's the communion. And the choir sing Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi, dona eis requiem, which translates as Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the earth, grant them rest. Now, what's interesting about this is they sing this in two chromatic lines. They go, which is actually the devil's interval. So it comes down on C, da 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 da, and up on F sharp, da 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 da, and over and over and over again. It's called a passacaglia or a ground bass, which is a musical form where one musical idea repeats over and over and over again. And over the top of this, the tenor, Peter Pears, sings this poem by Wilfred Owen. One ever hangs where shelled roads part. In this war, he too lost a limb, but his disciples hide apart, and now the soldiers bear with him. Near Golgotha strolls many a priest, and in their faces there is a pride that they were flesh-marked by the beast, by whom the gentle Christ is denied. The scribes on all the people shove and bawl allegiance to the state, but they who love the greater love lay down their lives. They do not hate. So this poem is actually an attack on religion. It's an attack on organized religion. It's saying the priests and the religious people are all bawling anger and law and wagging their fingers, while it's the soldiers who have laid down their lives for one another who are actually the ones that are carrying Christ's body to the tomb. It's very, very touching and affectionate. And in the clip I'm going to show you, it's a very rare piece of footage, this. Benjamin Britten, the composer, is conducting, and Peter Pears is singing. And this is, in all the pieces of music that Peter Pears sang, this is one of the most famous, because at the end of it, as the choir sing Grant Them Rest, Benjamin Britten inserts a little bit of Latin, Dona eis requiem, grant us peace. And it's a phrase that he writes for Peter Pears, it's very, very sweet, and it's specifically written for the sound of Peter Pears's voice. So let's take a quick listen to this, and then we'll wrap things up and we'll take some questions. Let me just get the screen up and we will disappear ourselves. Here's Benjamin Britten, by the way. I thought I'd give you a couple of seconds where you could just see him conducting. Now, did you notice, as you were listening to that, did you notice that there's a certain type of sweetness to that voice? It sounds very sweet. And here's a really interesting thing, as though this isn't complicated enough, right? Here's another little Freudian spin for you. Growing up as a child, Benjamin Britten used to accompany his mother on the piano. His mother would sing to him, and she would also sing to him when he went to bed. Benjamin Britten started writing music at the age of 5 years old, and he'd written nearly 1,000 pieces of music by the age of 15. So Britten and his mother were very, very close. And as I told you before, his relationship with Peter Pears started after his mother died. Now, Pears's natural voice was a baritone. In other words, the sounds you've just heard are not naturally his voice. Benjamin Britten was writing at that high for him, and he had to learn how to sing that high. And people that knew Britten's mother said Peter Pears sounded like Britten's mother singing. Whoa, right? That's kind of a bit deep. Okay, so yeah, this is complicated stuff. Like all great masterpieces, the picture is always complicated. It's never easy, which is why we go back to listening to them, right? Because we learn things. We don't have to agree, and this is important, right? We don't have to agree with artists. We don't have to be like them. We don't have to imitate their lifestyles. We don't have to have, but nonetheless, from their positions, they are able to communicate to us what it means to be human. And to close out completely here, I wanted to finish out by playing you just a couple of moments of Benjamin Britten himself talking in interview. And in this interview, this brief clip, you'll hear the interviewer, he starts out by asking Britten, you are a pacifist. In other words, Britten was a man who never fought in the army, never fought in the war, okay? And he also mentions Peter Grimes, which is one of Britten's most successful operas. With that said, let's just close out by listening to Benjamin Britten himself, and then we'll take some questions before we finish today, okay?
But you are a pacifist, aren't you? I mean, you're
yes,
committed pacifist.
Yes. Since I was a child at school, I think I have thought that way.
And, in fact, you were a conscientious objector during the Second World War.
Yes, yes, I was.
I've been thinking about your musical work and to see whether or not that's reflected in the in your work, if you're trying to give that kind of feeling in your work. And I think in Peter Grimes, War Requiem,
yes,
that's certainly true. Is that a conscious thing?
I believe that the artist must be consciously a human being. He is part of society, and he should not lock himself up in an ivory tower. I think he has a duty to play towards his fellow creatures. It is not only a duty, I feel it's a pleasure too. I want to have my music used. I would much rather, this seems perhaps a silly thing to say, but I would rather have my music used than write masterpieces which were not used.
Yes. Well, don't you think that some of your work are masterpieces?
Oh, that's not for me to say at all.
Why not? Why wouldn't you have the kind of confidence to think that you've done...
Because masterpieces, rather the word masterpiece has a kind of ring about it, which suggests lots of dusts on volumes in libraries.
You seem to get a great deal of pleasure and happiness out of working with other people.
I don't honestly think I can write in a vacuum. I have to write for people or for occasions.
I have to write for people and for occasions. And when the recording of Benjamin Britten's War Requiem came out, it sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Decca could not produce enough record sets. It was just one of the greatest selling classical records of all time. What was Britten's reaction? He was upset. He was offended that his record had sold so well. Why? Because I think the War Requiem, as much as a public statement, is also a very, very deeply personal and private one. Thanks, everyone. We have a little bit of time left over for questions. Do I need to stop sharing the screen? I probably do, right? There we go.
You can ask a question directly, or if you want to type something into the chat, I'm monitoring the chat too. So Dr. Allen would love to answer some of your questions.
Yeah, go ahead, ask away. Is everybody, it's too early in the morning, isn't it? for all this deep, heavy stuff. Maybe while you're thinking of some questions, Britten went on, he lived another, how long after this was it? He lived another about 15 years. He died quite young, 64 years old. He wrote about 16 operas, many of which are still performed around the world. Peter Grimes, probably his most famous one. There were an enormous number of performances of the War Requiem in the years immediately after it came out. Almost as though people were just desperate to have a piece of music that had to do with dealing with the war. I think it was a feeling of coming together. This piece caused people around the country of Great Britain, certainly, to feel like they could come together around a big masterpiece, even though Britten said he didn't like the idea of masterpieces, to sort of commemorate what had happened in the war. And of course, that war was a pretty significant one.
Without a doubt.
Everybody's been pushed into stunned silence. Any questions about this?
One person raised their hand. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I'm not able to. Oh, hold on a minute. Here's a question.
There is a question in the chat.
Yes. It says, why did Britten want a Russian soprano? Was it because of unity? Yes, it was partly that. Also, Britten had built an incredible friendship with now I've got to remember, Slava Rostropovich and his wife. And Rostropovich was a wonderful cellist, and Britten wrote some wonderful cello music for him. His wife was a very, very voluptuous soprano, Russian, full-blooded Russian singer. So he wanted to write a part for her, but unfortunately, the Russian authorities wouldn't allow her to fly out to give the first performance. So the first performance was given by an English singer called Heather Harper. But for the recording, they brought Galina out from Russia. She was finally released and she was able to do the recording. The second question, in the section that you mentioned that was an attack on religion, is part of the inspiration for Mozart with him being an atheist? If so, were some of the musical elements in that part based off any of Mozart's pieces? That's a very good question. Of course, I suppose you could ask the question, is there such a thing as atheist music? Or contrary, is there any such thing as religious music? I mean, some of the most religious music that people consider to be the apotheosis of God are found in Mozart. Isn't that interesting? The Requiem, the Masses. We think today of John Rutter, who writes a lot of choral music, but Rutter apparently is an atheist himself. That comes as a big shock to people that sing in choirs that don't know that about John Rutter. At one point, one composer called Robin Holloway said, I'm a Nietzschean, which basically means I don't believe in anything at all. He said, therefore, I have absolutely no problem at all writing music for the church, because why would I? If I don't believe in anything, then why wouldn't I write a lovely piece of music for the church? I mean, it doesn't matter if there's nothing. It doesn't matter whether you believe in God or not, if there's nothing, right? That's what Holloway said. So yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? And you know what's really interesting? I consider myself to be a Christian, quite a devoted one. And I've never, ever responded to any of these pieces of music as religious pieces. I remember actually as a student, seeing a performance of War Requiem and just feeling that it wasn't a religious piece of music at all, actually. And I think what Britten is doing here is, this is a complex, my PhD at Oxford University, my doctorate was actually on Benjamin Britten and Christianity. And it was specifically looking into this issue of what is guilt? Can guilt play out in music? Can it cause somebody to choose certain things in certain ways? Okay, for example, John Lennon in the Beatles, when John Lennon sings the word love, is there a consistent use of harmony and chords that shows something that he might believe about that subject? And Lennon often uses the chord of F sharp minor when he sings about love, which is a very unusual chord to use. So as a musicologist, that's sort of interesting, right? So to answer your question, to my knowledge, there's no specific reference to Mozart. There is a specific reference, though, to Verdi in the Dies Irae, rhythmically. The rhythm is very much indicating that there's a connection there with Verdi. That's a very, very good question, my friend. And probably to answer more of it, you have to track down my PhD thesis and have a read. It's a good cure for insomnia. Oh, yes.
Dr. Allen, I had a question posted here from Ethan. He asked, did Britten suggest that the choir dress in black and the soprano in white as in the video that you showed?
That's a very good question. Not to my knowledge, no. I think that's just the way concert dress is kind of dealt with by group by group. But what is interesting about that is when the record came out, and I've got it here somewhere, it's just the actual recording itself. It's just a jet black box, just black, with War Requiem in white print on it. It actually looks like a gravestone. And it's interesting, actually, because Peter Pears and Benjamin Britten are both buried next to each other in Orford Church in Aldeburgh, where they lived and had their music festival. And Benjamin Britten, their graves just have their names and their dates. There's nothing else. There's nothing religious. There's nothing secular. There's no poetry. It's just on the gravestones, their names and just their dates. Isn't that interesting? Good question. Is the War Requiem ever performed currently in its entirety publicly? Well, of course, not during COVID-19, unfortunately, right? But I would recommend going to a live performance if you ever get the chance. It's overwhelmingly powerful when it's done well. And especially when, even on those recordings you may have seen, that the two orchestras were quite close together, right? They were separated. And did you notice how Benjamin Britten was conducting only the chamber orchestra and another conductor was conducting the choir, the big choir, I should say. So the answer is, yes, it is performed fairly regularly. I've been to one performance in Trenton in the last 20 years since I've been in America, but it is possible to track it down. And I would encourage you, if you ever get a chance to travel to see it, I would take the trouble to do that. I would take the trouble to go and actually experience it live in a big acoustic space. Recording is extremely good too. If you've got a good sound system, the original recording with Benjamin Britten and the original team, it's never really been bettered. I mean, different interpretations put different slants on things, but Britten was a very, very good conductor, and most of the recordings of his own work still have stood the test of time, which is interesting. But you might think that black would be the right color, right? I should say, by the way, that at the very end of the piece, everybody comes together for the first time. The two men sing "Let Us Sleep Now," and then the boys sing "Enter into Paradise," and all of them performing D Lydian, this wonderful heavenly vision. But then suddenly the devil's bells come back and we hear Requiem Aeternam, and it keeps swinging between the heavenly vision and the devil's intervals. And it closes out with this big question mark, almost as though Britten's saying, I so much want my sin to be acceptable, but I have to admit that it really isn't. So at the end of the War Requiem, we're left with a question mark. We're not really left with a feeling of affirmation. And that, I think, is what makes the work really profound, especially as it relates to war, because wars will, unfortunately, almost always go on in this world of ours, which is, in a sense, this world is a kind of a war in and of itself, right? Some of you might have felt it was a war getting up this morning and turning your computer on and getting through this last hour. Sometimes life could be a bit of a struggle, right? So we're very familiar with it in that way as a subject. Do you think the reason Britten united the tritone devil's interval in the War Requiem was to allude to the idea that the devil was and is present in war? Yes, I do. I do think that. It's very, very interesting, isn't it, that Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story, Maria, da, 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 is the devil's interval. Da, da, da. Okay. And in the same way, West Side Story sort of deals with the battle between, you know, the Sharks and the Jets in Manhattan. By the way, Leonard Bernstein and Benjamin Britten were quite close when Britten was living in America. And there's a strong interaction between their music, actually. Okay, West Side was written before War Requiem, and I'm fairly certain that Britten used the tritone in War Requiem partly because of Bernstein's use of it. I think there's a little bit of a rivalry there. But yes, I think definitely he's implying that. And I think he's sort of implying, one of the singers that actually sang the tenor part, a guy called Robert Tier, once said, very controversially, let's be honest, we all secretly love the devil anyway, don't we? Now, that's a very controversial statement, right? And this was a guy that sang the War Requiem. So on one level, we might also be asking whether Britten is trying to make a case that the tritone is a musical interval, therefore why should it not be used in music? And let me tell you this, the tritone is a part of a mode, a church mode called the Lydian mode. Da, 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 da. And it goes up with the tritone and it sounds very sweet, like Peter Pears is singing. But when you put it over, like a C and an F sharp directly over each other, not as a melody, but as a single sound, that's when it sounds really creepy. By the way, the tritone is right in the middle of the octave. Isn't that interesting? It's right in the middle of the perfect fifth and the perfect fourth, but it's also right in the middle of the octave. So the octave revolves around the devil. And in that sense, you could say it is the world's music, right? He's singing, if you like, a song of the world, because the devil, as we know, this world belongs, it is ultimately God's world. He created it, but when it fell, it became the devil's world. No, I don't think anybody would say this world is basically a good place in which bad things happen. I think we'd all agree it's a bad place in which good things occasionally happen. And I think that Britten is sort of dealing with that idea in this piece, you know. It's quite deep, isn't it?
Dr. Allen?
Yes.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I'm going to sort of cut the questions off so that we have time to get through our virtual recordings. But you always have a way of bringing music to life. And I've been enjoying that over the 10 years or so that I've known you. And I'm sure that all of our kids here in District 7 did today too. Thank you, sir, very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me, Chris. And thank you, everybody.
Give them a wave instead of
give us a virtual wave, everybody.
Virtual wave.
Love you guys. Stay well and safe, okay? Hope to see you again sometime.
You bet.
Bye.
I would like to announce to all of our seniors that PMEA has scholarships available for students planning a career in music education. And an additional scholarship based on service to school and community, the Robert F. Ryan Scholarship that we started last year. The deadline is on April 15th and information can be found on the District 7 website. I'm going to share the chorus virtual recording with you that was engineered by Eric Griffiths, who's the chorus director at Cumberland Valley. And this is a Kyrie. So give me a second here to share my screen. And share sound. Okay. Can you see my screen?
I don't believe we can, Dr. Campbell.
All right, I'm sorry. It's making me go into someplace that I'm not familiar with. Let's move on from that. And thank you, Mr. Buderbaum, who is the sound engineer for the orchestra, string orchestra, and also the band video. So Mr. Buderbaum, why don't you go ahead and share yours?
All right, and I'll go ahead and move on to the band recording of Irish Tune. Let's see if I can find it here. There you have it.
Thank you, Mr. Budabaugh, for that wonderfully engineered piece. We really appreciate all of your hard work with that.
Absolutely.
I also should note that the string piece by Francis Caravella, he's the orchestra director at Mannheim Township, and was very generous to allow us to use his piece. I will try to figure out my own system preferences here, and we'll either send the chorus video out to a link to everybody, or if I have a chance, I'll get to it before we welcome Katrina Flick at 12:30, our vocalist, and I'll try to play it then as well. Thank you everybody for attending our first session today. Next one starts at 10:30, and this is a Hershey graduate by the name of Will Curry, professor